Today on Data Center Shorts, we have David Rankin, based out of London, as a project manager. David, welcome.
Many thanks, Jim. We've been speaking quite a lot over the summer on various projects. So I'm thankful to be on your podcast today.
Great. Well, it's great to have you. And I think that we're very interested on what's happening in London. So why don't you give us a sense of what trends you're seeing today in the co-location in the London market?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think sort of the first trend is that there's a imbalance with demand and supply. And I think that imbalance will likely remain throughout the rest of the year and into 2024. And that is that demand is continuing to outstrip supply. London is the largest co-location market in Europe at about 902 megawatts, JLL are reporting, and that's a 35% share of the tier one supply across the FLAP-D market. I think all markets, including London, have under-delivered with this new supply. The only exception of that in Europe is Frankfurt. However, London's still on track to hit a gigawatt of supply next year, and it'll be the first European market to do so. I think leading on from that, another trend is that on most new deployments and supply coming online, pre-lets are very common now, and that's making it hard for the smaller tenants to find adequate capacity. I remember 5 years ago, we were talking about 5-10 megawatts being large deployments. Now retail enterprise deployments are reaching this level, and tens of megawatts are now considered hyperscale deployments. So going back to sort of another trend is the power constraints in London, and I think that's another trend you're going to see not just in London but across Europe, is that in the key metros like London, power is very constrained, and actually across all of the south of England, and connection requests are being sort of delayed from 2028 to 2032 and even later in that decade. So I think operators going to have a rethink on how they secure power, if that's going to be on-site renewable power generation, and also collaborating more with utility companies to find solutions in a challenging power network.
Interesting. We're seeing that in a lot of the major markets in the States and also globally. So what we're seeing in terms of a lot of different factors on demand, what are you seeing kind of in London and the EMEA market on, like you said, the increase in the size of requirements as well as the velocity of the requirements?
Yeah, so I think sort of two things are happening. I mean, cloud is the big driver of these deployments, but enterprises are also rethinking their technical real estate solution. They were beginning to do this before the COVID pandemic. I think that put a pause on rethinking their enterprise IT strategy, since the primary objective was to get employees back into the office. I now think that they've started to sort of execute on that strategy, and I think they've now got a strategy on that, and now they're looping back into picking up on their operations and what they're going to do with that. So in the last fortnight, I've had several conversations with smaller enterprises on what they're going to do with their on-premise data center, from taking pockets of capacity on multiple floors, or moving or assessing what their data center is looking like in the basement of their building. And we're starting to do a sort of stay versus go and auditing session on the benefits of moving to a dedicated co-location operator.
Got it. And then what have you seen with co-location rates over the last couple of years? Like, give us a range of kind of like what the numbers are and what they have been like pre-pandemic.
Yeah, so I guess starting with sort of hyperscale pricing in the sort of multi-megawatts, I mean, there's some talks of getting some pretty attractive rates. Obviously, the more capacity you take, the better the rate's going to be. But in the last sort of couple of years, you could get pricing sort of below £100 a kilowatt with some low escalation indexation rates of sub 2%. Pricing now, I think sort of last year, just about under £100 was competitive. Now for multi-megawatts, over £100 is more common, and you'll really struggle to get below the £100 mark. And I think that represents an increase of about 15% increase in the colocation rates on last year. So I'm not sure if that's sort of in line with what you're seeing in the US. I've heard of upwards of 20-30% increase in rates.
Yeah, it's across the board, but that's kind of a good range of what we're seeing. Some are close to 10, but there are other markets that definitely have seen 15 to 20. So
I was just going to mention sort of retail colocation rates as well. And I think this is a bit harder to pinpoint, but as a broad brush, under £250 a kilowatt for retail colo rates is quite competitive. Obviously, the devil's in the detail, and each enterprise requirement is slightly different depending on their sort of technical requirements, and then also depends on each individual operator's supply and demand and pipeline. But generally speaking, rates below sort of £250 a kilowatt are quite competitive.
David, you mentioned that there's a gig capacity coming to the London market. Just what's driving that? What groups are driving that?
Yeah, so I think that's a split between hyperscalers and the data center operators. Power and land is very constrained in London, and they're starting to sort of move away outside of the London market. The London market historically has developed out of the Docklands and then expanded into sort of the wider greater London market, primarily focused in Slough as you move west out of London along the main motorway over to west of England and on towards America. I think hyperscalers and data center operators are now sort of moving slightly further away from those sort of key clusters to escape the noise of the lack of power and lack of supply, and even moving further than 50 kilometers outside of London. So it'll be interesting to see how going forwards the London market is going to be sort of broken down and what encompasses the London market.
Mm-hmm. And you said they're going to Slough. What other areas are they looking at?
Yeah, so Slough is the sort of primary location outside of the Docklands. Mm-hmm. You've got various number of data center operators sort of dotted around the M25. There's talks of a hyperscaler moving east of London, and then there's also pockets of data center clusters near to Slough, 5-10 kilometers away, being Ealing and Hayes and Royal Park.
Right. And then we're seeing this in a lot of the major markets. So I'm really curious as it relates to London, David, is how is artificial intelligence coming into seeing new demand and requirements in London?
Yeah, so I mean, as you're probably aware, so the European DC market lags probably sort of 16 to 18 months behind the US. Mm-hmm. So while I've seen sort of regular announcements of operators in the US acquiring large amounts of land and power, it hasn't really arrived in the UK, London, and Europe at scale. I think there's still quite a few questions to be answered, but the early requirements are for 100-acre sites capable of delivering hundreds of megawatts of power. There have been some projects in Europe that can rival that scale. So there's a €3 billion, 300-megawatt campus in Berlin, Germany, and another 500-megawatt campus south of Lisbon in Portugal. However, we haven't quite seen that scale in the UK. There are a couple of projects around London that are proposing this scale. There's a 600 megawatt data center campus proposed in East London, which is 15 miles away from the Docklands data center cluster. However, I think it will encounter quite a few questions, mainly relating to the planning regulations, as it's situated on green belt land, which does not permit. Funny enough, this call is quite timely because recently, just this week, a large data center campus proposed in West London was recently dismissed, as I said, sort of this week by the Secretary of State. Now, despite recognizing the supply constraints in Slough and the project was ultimately refused because it was situated on greenbelt lands, and that gave the ultimate weighting. So I think that's going to cause a few headaches for other data center operators that do have proposed schemes on greenbelt lands around the M25 in London.
That's interesting. Well, David, I think you gave us a great overview and snapshot of London. Thank you. We look forward to staying in contact and getting continual updates. And we appreciate you being on the podcast. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jim. It's been a pleasure talking to you and great working with you.
Of course.